Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mrna, Director of Community Health at Robert Wood Johnson University Hospital, Somerset. Welcome to today's webinar on Stick It to COVID-19, the Benefits of Vaccination, presented in collaboration with Friends Health Connection. Healthcare workers across New Jersey recently began receiving the COVID-19 vaccine, and the vaccine will soon become available to community members, including essential workers and individuals over the age of 75. During today's webinar, we will learn more about the vaccine, how it works, and how safe and effective it is from our special guest, Dr. Ron Nahass, an infectious disease specialist who is the hospital epidemiologist for Robert Wood Johnson University Hospital, Somerset. Thank you for joining us. We will begin today's webinar with 45 minutes of a moderated discussion, followed by questions and answers from our audience. Should our audience have questions, please post them in the question and answer section. So Dr. Nahass, thank you again for joining us. Can we start off by having you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Mrna, for having me. Pleased to be here. As you mentioned, I'm an infectious disease physician. I've been practicing in this community now for over 30 years, and I'm the hospital epidemiologist at Somerset Medical Center, part of RWJBarnabas Health. And I've had that role for about 20 years, and in that capacity, I'm responsible for oversight of infection prevention, and in this particular year, oversight of the COVID medical team and the response to managing and treating the COVID illness that we're seeing in our community.
Well, thank you, and thank you for joining us. So let's begin with an overview of what is a vaccine and how it works.
So the COVID vaccine, also known as SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, is designed to allow us, humans, to mount what's called an immune response. And by doing so, to some degree, trick the body into thinking that we were actually infected by this virus, but we don't get sick. And then when that happens, we are then develop a protection for a future infection. So you take the vaccine, your body develops an immune response. That immune response then protects you from a future infection from the virus.
Okay, thank you. So how do you measure the effectiveness of a vaccine?
So in measuring how well we're doing with that, there's two principal ways that we measure the effectiveness of a vaccine. The first actually informs us from a test tube perspective, and we're able to actually look at the amount of antibody. Antibody is what protects us from an infection. When we give a vaccine to a patient or a human, we can measure the level of antibody in the blood, and that can be correlated to protective effect. The more important measure, though, so that's a test tube measure. The more important measure is how well does it do in real life. So if you take a vaccine and you expose, or somebody gets exposed to the virus, how likely is it that you're going to get infected if you have the vaccine versus if you don't have the vaccine? So in the studies that were done, that's exactly how it was done. We gave a bunch of people the vaccine, we gave a bunch of people the placebo, and we compared the rate of COVID in the people who got the vaccine compared to the rate of COVID in the people who got the placebo, and you look at the difference. And that difference is the level of protection. And in the case of the vaccines that we currently have available here in New Jersey and the United States, the Mrna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine, that level of protection is about 95%. Truly a remarkable achievement in protection for any vaccine, let alone for a new disease that really has only been around for about a year.
Thank you, and thank you for that explanation of, what a vaccine is in general, and then, really focusing in on COVID-19. So, I know one of the concerns is, side effects. So how do you evaluate the side effects of a vaccine?
So similar to what we just described as to how do we understand how it works or how do we measure its effectiveness, in that same group of individuals, our first look at side effects is to compare the rate of side effects in the people who got the vaccine compared to the group of people who got the placebo. And then you can say, okay, placebo caused, let's say, a headache this many times, and the vaccine caused a headache this many times, and we compare the two, and we say, okay, headache occurred, 10% more in people who got the vaccine versus people who did not. In this particular case, for both the Mrna and the Pfizer vaccine, altogether about 75, almost 80,000 individuals were involved in the studies. So that meant that 40,000 people got a vaccine, 40,000 people got a placebo. And it really gave us the opportunity to evaluate side effects in a lot of individuals. It was really an extraordinary accomplishment and speaks, frankly, to the willingness of the public to step up, because having not done that, we wouldn't have gotten these results so quickly. What did we find out? We found out that in the clinical trials, that the most common side effects are things we kind of expected that you would see with a vaccine. So you go get a vaccine, you get your flu shot, you get a tetanus shot, the arm hurts a bit for a day or two after. That, in fact, is the most common side effect we see in the vaccine studies with the COVID vaccine, probably close to 80%. Now, mind you, 20%, 15 to 20% of people who get a placebo get a sore arm. So the difference is about 60% for the sore arm. Outside of the sore arm from the vaccine, what else was seen? Fatigability, headache, body aches, muscle soreness. Those are the most common side effects that you see with this vaccine. Sound pretty similar to what happens when you get a flu shot or a shingles shot or a tetanus shot. In fact, very much alike like what we see with other vaccines.
Yeah, and that's interesting that the folks that had the placebo shot also had the soreness in the arm too.
Right.
So that's very interesting.
Well, don't forget, when they did the study, the placebo, and think about it for yourselves, all of you who are on this webinar, would you have volunteered to go into a vaccine study to get a placebo? Placebo means you got a shot. So you got a needle put into your arm and they gave you a saline injection. And so the actual process of putting a needle into the muscle does cause discomfort, whether you get a vaccine or you get a saline injection. So it's not surprising that the arm hurt a little bit, because they do put a needle in. It's not, they didn't give you a pill to take. They gave you a shot. So.
Yeah. Now we often hear about herd immunity, and herd immunity is the ultimate goal of any vaccine. So can you tell us what that means?
Sure. Herd immunity, it's an interesting concept. So herd, we think of a herd of animals. In this case, as it relates to humans, it's the population. So we all are the herd. And the goal here with herd immunity is to get enough of the people, enough of the herd, enough of all of us immune to this disease so that it cannot be transmitted from person to person. In order for that to happen, you don't need everybody immune. You need a certain portion of the population or the herd immune. And if you have enough people in the population, enough of the herd immune, transmission becomes impossible. And so there's a statistical calculation that scientists and epidemiologists can do to determine what that number is. In the case of COVID, that number turns out to be somewhere around 70 to 75%, maybe 80%. We thought maybe earlier in the epidemic it was 65%. So somewhere in that range, we need to be immune in order to achieve herd immunity. The problem with that, and the discussion, a lot of the discussion in the news, is you can achieve that two ways. You can achieve that naturally. If we didn't have a vaccine, that means enough people get sick to achieve that statistical number, 60, 70, 80% of the people become immune, and then transmission can no longer occur, and we no longer have the epidemic. The problem with that is the death rate. The death rate is not insignificant here, and although it seems small on a percentage basis, a few percent, 5, 6%, remember, we already have about 350 to almost 400,000 individuals in the US who've died. And we estimate that about 15% of the population has had the disease. So to get to herd immunity, we need 5 times as many, 4 to 5 times as many, to get infected if we don't have a vaccine. I said we already have 350,000 people who've died. So if we get that number more to get the infection naturally, that's 4 to 5 times more people who have to succumb or who will succumb as a result of this infection. That's an awful way to think about getting to herd immunity. It would happen, but at the cost of many other lives. Even if the docs, and I think we are better at treating people, the mortality rate is not below 1%. So even if the mortality is 2 or 3 times as much, you're talking about another 1 million people, 800,000 people who'd succumb in this country alone. That's really an untenable situation. So we need a vaccine to achieve herd immunity in a way that saves lives and protects our population.
Definitely. So let's specifically talk about the COVID-19 vaccine. The COVID-19 vaccine is an mRNA vaccine. Can you explain to everybody what that is?
I'll try and walk us through an explanation for it, because I think this notation of mRNA sometimes raises concerns that we're kind of playing with our genes. And so I want to walk us through this and try and help understand it. So mRNA itself stands for messenger, M for messenger, RNA, ribonucleic acid. This is not DNA, it's RNA. And messenger RNA is part of the communication system within our bodies and within really almost any living thing, including viruses. It turns out the SARS-CoV-2 virus is an RNA virus. DNA, which is different, deoxyribonucleic acid, is the genetic code. That's where our genes are held, is in the DNA. The DNA lives in a human cell in the part of the cell called the nucleus. Messenger RNA lives in the part of the cell called the cytoplasm, 2 different parts. Messenger RNA does not live in the nucleus. Human DNA in us codes for mRNA in the different cells of our body. And that mRNA in our bodies that is coded by our genetic makeup, our DNA, actually acts as a bit of a recipe for our cells to tell the cells what to do. For example, in the pancreas, it tells our cells to make insulin so that our blood sugars are controlled and we don't have diabetes, keeps them in a safe level. In the case of mRNA vaccines, scientists have figured out how to take a small portion of mRNA, the recipe, if you will, of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the virus that causes COVID. They then package it into a fat globule, a really small portion into a fat globule. This fat globule is what is injected into our arms when we go get our vaccine. This mRNA, small portion from the virus, is then read by our cells, the cells in our body. And they take that recipe and they make what's called an antigen, a small portion from the surface of the virus that actually then causes our immune system to react and produce antibodies that can then protect us. It's actually the ultimate in a Trojan horse. It actually tricks the body without us getting sick to thinking we're being exposed to the virus. It produces the immune response that then protects us should we be exposed to the virus. It's really an incredible technology that it developed over the last 10 years. The portion of RNA that's actually injected only codes for a tiny, tiny piece of the virus. And so as a result of that, our bodies cannot make the virus. We cannot get sick from the virus. We will not have the virus as a result of that. And furthermore, as I pointed out in the beginning of the discussion, it does not affect our DNA. This is RNA, not DNA, and so it cannot alter our genes. So an amazing opportunity to safely achieve vaccination with extraordinarily low downside risk.
Thank you. That was a great explanation. I appreciate that. So who was included in the COVID-19 trials? Before you talked about the trials and you talked about, a number of people that were included in the trials, but can you, really expound upon like who they used for the clinical trials?
Yeah, again, as I mentioned earlier, anybody that wants to can Google it and look. It was an extraordinary accomplishment, and it continues to be, as to how people stepped up to be enrolled in these studies. And it's one of the reasons we were able to successfully do this so quickly. But the studies involved for these two vaccines, somewhere around 80,000 individuals, half got placebo, half got the vaccine. And if you look at the makeup of the individuals in the studies, it was really extraordinary about the diversity. And when I talk about diversity, I'm not simply talking about ethnic or racial diversity, talking about age diversity. I'm talking about diversity that also includes people with what's called comorbid conditions. One of the things that we all have heard in the news is how this disease affects people with certain illnesses or certain underlying health concerns. For example, people who are overweight, people who have heart disease, people who have lung disease. So the studies made an extraordinary effort to include people with multiple comorbidities. So when you look at it, it truly reflects the population that's being affected by the disease. So a really remarkable accomplishment, particularly given the speed with which it had to be enrolled. I should point out, Serena, just one other thing, because this comes up and it may obviate a question. No children under 16 were enrolled. So that is one of the, if you will, critiques of the studies, is that pediatric enrollments were not included specifically within the clinical trials. A trial for children is being looked at to start over the next month or two. So that was one group not included.
So did the trials at all, talk about, in terms of who was included, did it break it down by age, gender, race as well?
Yeah, as I mentioned, there was great diversity, whether it be by age. And so if you look at the clinical trials, you'll see that they report results for people over 65, as well as different decades of people involved. They were balanced between sex, men and women. They were balanced as it relates, or they were distributed along racial and ethnic diversities as well. And so, yeah, there was a great effort to make sure that there was, a good distribution along individuals, that it was important to understand the vaccine's responsive.
Great. And thank you for elaborating a little bit on that. So before I asked you about how, in general, effectiveness of vaccines are measured, and you talked a little bit about the effectiveness, and the current vaccines. So how effective are the COVID vaccines? And maybe you can expand upon the different vaccines out there as well.
Yeah, so in New Jersey, and the vaccines that we're looking at the moment are the two mRNA vaccines, and we went through the explanation of what that is. One was made by Mrna and one is made by Pfizer. The response to those vaccines, or the effectiveness of those vaccines, are essentially equivalent. So they have a 95% efficacy, and in the beginning we talked about how we measure that. So for example, to make it simple, if there were 100 people who got COVID in the placebo arm, 95% efficacy would mean that only 5%, 5 people got COVID in the vaccine arm. So 100 versus 5, so a 95% reduction in the incidence is what was seen with the vaccine. A remarkable accomplishment, highly effective, way better than we expected. You may recall that at the beginning of our COVID experience, if you will, back last spring, there was hope that we would get to a vaccine that would protect us with about a 60% protectiveness. We were far beyond that. We beat expectations in a big way, achieving 95% protection. I would point out, since it's been in the news, and I'll just comment, the vaccine's not available here, but they did approve in the UK the so-called AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, which is a different vaccine. It's a viral vector vaccine. That vaccine appears to be, at least in the way that it was studied, only about 70% effective. We, however, will not be administering that vaccine here at this point, and it's not available to be administered here at this point.
Thank you. So you kind of touched about it a little bit on safety. So how safe is the COVID-19 vaccine?
Yeah, I mentioned that earlier. These say when we talked about how we measure safety, we compare it, placebo arm, vaccine arm, but the vaccines really appear remarkably safe. And, I've had mine, my arm felt a little bit sore and I got a little bit of a headache. I describe myself as a headache person. Almost anything I do seems to give me a headache, but I got a bit of a headache for a day or two. But that's sort of the feature. The side effects generally are the things that you expect to see with a vaccine. So a sore arm is the most common. I mentioned earlier, about 70 to 80% of people get a bit of a soreness to their arm. But then you expect to see some other reactions like body aches, muscle aches, headache. I got a headache. Some folks will get a fever or chills. None of the reactions are severe and no life-threatening side effects are seen. As we've rolled out the vaccine to large numbers of people across the world, we are starting to see some things that we're not seeing in the clinical trials. The one thing that has been in the news a little bit is what's called an anaphylactic or allergic type reaction. That was not generally seen in the trials, and there's a reason for that. So far in the US, as measured up through the end of December, about 2 million people had been given the vaccine and had been evaluated for this reaction. There were 21 of these allergic reactions in those 2 million individuals. If you do the math, I did, it translates into about 1 in 90,000 individuals have that reaction. So remember, I just told you that about 35 to 40,000 people got the vaccine in the clinical trial. If the incidence of this problem is 1 in 90,000, it's not surprising it wasn't seen in the clinical trial. It's just too infrequent. So that's a pretty uncommon side effect, but it was not seen in the clinical trials. So we are attentive for it. It's part of the reason why when folks get the vaccine, they're asked to stick around for a bit while they're monitored for any allergic reactions. But in general, and has been reported, those 21 individuals all were fine. They got treated and went home. And so there was no, again, real consequence to that. So that's about the frequency that we've seen in that regard. The common thing, another common question about this is long-term side effects. We don't know the answer to that yet. What we have is about a 6-month window at this point when we include the earlier studies that were done back in the summer. And we haven't seen long-term consequences from this vaccine at this point from the preliminary studies that were done this past summer or in the 3 or 4 month observation window for the current studies. But we don't have 5 years of data on this vaccine. What we do have, which is important to understand, is that this technology, while new as it relates to this vaccine, has been around for a while. And vaccine technology continues to be studied. So mRNA vaccines have actually been given to people over about the last 8 to 10 years, and no long-term consequences from mRNA vaccines that have been given in clinical trials has been seen. So we don't really have an expectation for long-term side effects based on the technology related to this vaccine and the science I described earlier around mRNA vaccine and how it interacts with the human body. We just don't, there's really no biological way to explore or to expect a long-term consequence.
And thank you. I just wanted to touch upon something you had mentioned when you were talking about the shot and soreness. Is there anything that somebody could do in preparation of taking the vaccine? Like the recommendation is typically with a flu shot, you might want to take some, Advil or Motrin for the soreness. Is that similarly the same thing with the COVID vaccine?
Yeah, I think that it's perfectly reasonable. In one of the studies, in fact, not either of the mRNA vaccine studies, but the AstraZeneca study, they offered Tylenol up front to folks in case they were concerned about the arm soreness. So it's certainly okay to take acetaminophen or an Advil if you are concerned about that, or if your arm aches a bit. There would be no harm in doing that, and it will not. And this question has been asked of me a lot. impact your immune response to this particular vaccine. So I would have no hesitation in taking an Advil or taking an acetaminophen, if you were concerned.
Great, thank you so much. So, another thing that we typically hear right from the community is that, with vaccines, typically they take around a couple years to develop, and with the COVID-19 vaccine, how was it developed so quickly?
Yeah, that is a really common question. And so it's a couple of years would be generous, Serena. Vaccines usually take somewhere between 10 to 15 years to develop. So it is remarkable that it was developed so quickly. And I usually cite, a number of reasons, principally four, that we were so fortunate to develop these vaccines as quickly as we did. So let me just enumerate them for you. The first is that the platforms of the vaccine development that were used here enable us. They're really new technology that's amazing. They enable us to scale very quickly. And we were fortunate that these platforms actually had evolved over the last 10 years. The platforms themselves are not new. They actually had been developed 10, 12 years in the making. And so they were sitting there ready for this bug to come along, if you will, and allow us, given the technologic advances, to scale up very quickly. So we're very fortunate in that regard. The second is really the unprecedented global effort related to the development of these vaccines. You had scientists at universities and pharma companies united across the globe in disparate businesses and in disparate pharma companies, competitors, working in coordination, lockstep, to do this. That was an unbelievable commitment to the scientific and pharma community to basically planning and development and leverage the extraordinary talent that exists in this arena. The third reason was the unlimited resources that were brought to bear. And when I say unlimited resources, it's not only what I described as the talent, because that's true, but it's also the financial resources of multiple governments that essentially backstopped the pharma companies. Normally, the pharma industry or the vaccine producers take the risk, the financial risk, that it won't be successful. In this case, many national governments contributed lots of money to backstop the risk. So pharma essentially had almost no downside risk if it failed. The government of many countries took on the downside risk, and so that made it way more doable. And the last reason, and I've said this before and I can't emphasize it enough, the huge importance of the volunteer pool. I didn't mention at the beginning, but throughout my career, I've been a clinical researcher. I've done clinical research my entire life, and you cannot have stuff like this happen without volunteers willing to do this. And then think about it. How many of this audience would have been willing to step up and do a placebo-controlled trial with an unknown germ, with an unknown vaccine, with an unknown set of side effects to advance this process for everybody else's well-being? Because you had no idea whether you were going to be hurt or not, whether it was going to work or not, and whether you were going to get placebo or not. And we needed that to happen fast. And that occurred within 2 months. Within 2 months, they enrolled 80,000 individuals that volunteered to do that. So this would not have been done this quickly had we not found folks willing to do that. And I think that speaks volumes about people's willingness to be supportive of what was really a global crisis. And so I think those are the four reasons, but I really love to emphasize, as you can tell, the point of the volunteerism that was necessary. So everybody had a hand in it. It wasn't just the scientists, it wasn't the doctors, it wasn't the pharma company, it was everybody. So that's the reason.
That's amazing. So thank you for that great explanation. So let's talk about in terms of the vaccine. I know a lot of times when people take a vaccine like the flu, they're fearful that the vaccine can give them like the flu vaccine can give them the flu. Similarly, can the vaccine give you COVID-19?
This vaccine, this mRNA vaccine, cannot give you COVID. It's physically, biologically impossible. If you remember the explanation, the discussion about how we make this vaccine, we take a small portion of the RNA of this virus, which codes, which is the recipe for a specific protein, one protein only of this virus, and administer it to each of us, which allows our cells to produce that protein. It can't produce a viable virus. There's no physical, biological way for that to happen. We're not injecting the virus. We're not injecting a whole virus, a partial virus. We're injecting a tiny, tiny piece of the genetic code of this virus. And so there's just no way for us to get the disease from this particular vaccine. It's impossible. In fact, one of the things that has come up as we've expanded the administration of the vaccine, which is somewhat interesting along the lines of this question, is that we've given a number of people the vaccine, and within the first week they get sick, and it turns out they have COVID. It's important to understand getting COVID in that first week after the vaccine means you already had the COVID virus in you and it was incubating. The vaccine did not give you COVID, and that's important to understand for two reasons. One, the vaccine doesn't give you immediate protection. So when you get the vaccine, you don't get this cloak of invincibility on day one. And it's not a get out of jail free card, and it doesn't allow you to go out with abandon and expose yourself. You will get sick from the virus if you expose yourself on the day you get the vaccine. And getting sick with COVID in that week, in particular, after the vaccine, is not because you got the vaccine. It's because you got exposed. It's really important to understand that as a principle. And it's also important for us as clinicians to remember that, because when we see somebody who has COVID symptoms the week after the vaccine, it's likely because they got COVID. It's not from the vaccine. It's really an important point.
So let's refresh our audience's memory. What is the incubation period for COVID?
Yeah, the incubation period for COVID is somewhere between 5 to 7 days, generally closer to 5, but 5 to 7 is when most people incubate it. So that means from the point at which you're exposed and the virus lands in your nose or in your mouth or in your eye until when you get sick is on average about 5 to 7 days.
Okay. Thank you. Now, I know this next question, you kind of answered it a little bit, but just because we're on this type of questioning, again, what are the side effects people should expect when they get the vaccine?
Yeah, we kind of went through this. Again, it's the vaccine side effects that you'd expect. Sore arm, body aches, muscle aches, a little bit of headache. I mentioned I'm a headache guy, and I got a headache for a day or so after I got the vaccine. These side effects last for, 1 or 2 days, and then they go away, like they do when you get the flu shot. If you happen to get a side effect, or you get the tetanus shot and you get a sore arm, it lasts 1 or 2 days and then it goes away. That's generally what we see with vaccine side effects.
So then how long are people protected after getting the vaccine?
Yeah, that is the $1 million question. So we don't really know yet, but we have some information that gives us some idea of what to expect. So two or three lines of evidence for this. One, 2 diseases that we've had experience with in the past, SARS-1 and MERS, both of which are caused by what's called a beta coronavirus. SARS-2 or COVID is caused by a beta coronavirus. If we look at the immunity that occurred after SARS-1 and the immunity that occurred after MERS, it was about 2 or 3 years. So a lot of us think that it's going to last that long. We're hopeful for that, but we think that it may be up to 2 or 3 or maybe even longer. Second line of evidence, if we look at the antibody levels in the blood, and you remember from the beginning of our webinar, we talked about how we measure immunity. We measure immunity in part by looking at antibody levels in the blood. And we can measure that over time in people who've gotten a vaccine. And if you do that, you can get what's called a decay curve of the antibody levels in the blood. How quickly is it declining? And if you look at the decay curves after vaccine, we're now out at about 8 months from when the vaccines first started being given this past summer. And you can see that the decay curves look like that level of antibody is going to remain in a protective zone for at least a year, if not longer. So I think we're reasonably optimistic that at this point, it seems like it's at least a year. We're hopeful, based on experience with 2 other viruses that are similar, that it will be 2 or 3 years. And we're praying that it might actually be longer.
So I know you touched upon this a little bit, but will individuals still have to wear their mask?
Yeah, that's another important question that we don't know. Lots of stuff we know, lots we don't know. We're going to continue to learn about this as we go along. But what we understand is once you get the vaccine, you know, after the second dose, you're not going to get sick from COVID. Did I say that right? You're not going to get sick from COVID after the second dose. That's the reason you get the vaccine. But what we don't know is if you were exposed to someone with COVID, might you then, even though you're not going to get sick, might you then transmit it to someone else who wasn't as smart as you, and they didn't get the vaccine? We don't know the answer to that question. And so for the time being, out of an abundance of caution, we are advising that people wear a mask after they get the vaccine, even though they're not going to get sick, so that they're not transmitting it to their colleagues, their friends, or family who are being stubborn and not taking the vaccine. So we're wearing the mask until we understand this transmission dynamic better after receiving the vaccine. We just don't know the answer yet to that question.
Okay, so let's talk about somebody who's already had COVID-19. So if you've already had it, do you need to get the vaccine?
Again, more to learn in this regard. So always more to learn. It's a new disease. What we don't know, as I just said, is with absolute certainty what the duration of immunity is, whether it's after you've gotten the disease or after the vaccine. So until we better understand that, yes, we are advising people, whether they've had the disease or not, everyone needs to get the vaccine. If you've had the illness or the infection, we're suggesting that you delay the vaccination for about 90 days. It's not mandatory, it's not a rule. We're making that suggestion because it's pretty clear you're not going to get sick in those first 3 months after you've been infected. And so we don't want to, number one, waste a dose of the vaccine in those first 3 months because you're not going to get sick anyway. But also importantly, someone who recently had the disease is not likely to have any meaningful response to the vaccine because their own antibody is going to block the vaccine's effect and you're not going to mount an immune response to it. So we don't think there's going to be an impact in those first 90 days. After those 90 days, we think you should get vaccinated because we don't know the answer on durability, and we think it'll boost your immunity should you be exposed again.
Okay. So now, individuals seeking more information about the vaccine, where can they find it? What resources are available?
There's a number of different places to go. I think that I've advised and generally suggested stick to the reliable sources. The cdc.gov site is really a great wealth of information. The New Jersey Department of Health website also is helpful to help you get to those sites because it can be confusing. In your search engine, you're going to type New Jersey Department of Health COVID vaccine, and the same thing for the CDC COVID vaccine. And if you do that, you'll be taken to those sites that'll provide you more information.
Great, thank you so much. Now, so here at Robert Wood Johnson University Hospital, Somerset, you were the first person to actually get the vaccine back in December. So can you tell our audience why you chose to get the vaccine?
I wasn't quite the first person, but I was one of the early recipients. And, you know, I think that there were a number of reasons. You know, one is as part of the leadership of the medical response, I wanted to make sure that people, that I could help reassure individuals that this was safe to do. Number two, it just was, and I mentioned the volunteerism of all these people who stepped up and really sacrificed for all of us to prove that this vaccine worked. And because of that, I want to some degree honor their commitment because they did that for all of us. Number three, I did it for myself and my family. Not crazy. I'm in one of the risk groups, and so the older risk group. But it is a risk.
I wasn't going to say anything.
it is a risk. This disease is terrible. I can't emphasize that enough. I invite anybody who doesn't understand or is suspicious of that to make rounds with me in the intensive care unit. It's a terrible disease. And this is something all of us can do as a community to protect our families and our communities and allow us to get back to what I like to say is usual order. I am tired of social distancing. And my wishes for the new year is that we are socially close. We're not going to be socially close if we don't get to herd immunity. We're not going to get to herd immunity if we don't do the vaccine. And so I think all of those things entered into my decision-making and my thinking about trying to, about stepping up and making sure that it was clear that this was the thing to do.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Nahass. You've just provided us with a ton of great information. And at this time, I do want to open it up to questions and answers from our audience. So if members of our audience do have some questions, please post them in the question and answer section. What I will try to do is, because there are quite a number of them, I'm going to kind of go through them, and for the questions that, if there are many, I'll try to lump them together. And some of them I already see we've already answered, such as side effects and things like that. Some of them are very specific, but for someone who just finished radiation for breast cancer, hypothetically, is that individual's immune system still compromised, and is it safe to get the vaccine?
Yeah, I flipped through a bunch of these questions, so I'm going to tackle a whole bunch of them with that question. So that's a great question, and thank you. We did not touch on that in the webinar. So whether it be radiation or any other condition that might potentially compromise immune system or immune response. So we're going to lump in together radiation, chemotherapy, transplant rejection, people with HIV or AIDS, anyone that's got a condition that might somehow run the risk that you might have a compromised immune system or that your immune system isn't working quite at the same level as somebody without those conditions. The answer is get the vaccine. One, there's no danger because you cannot get COVID. Remember, this is mRNA, small portion of the genetic material, simply tells your cells to make a protein. Number two, even if your immune response might not be quite as robust as someone else, any response is better than no response. And so the potential benefit to you as an individual is extraordinary as it relates to the risk of the disease, getting the disease versus some response to the vaccine. Some response to the vaccine is much better than assuming the risk of getting the disease. So hands down, it's a slam dunk. If you have a potential compromise to your immune system, whether it be by a treatment you're receiving or an underlying illness, an autoimmune disorder of some type, or a chemotherapy you're getting, or a cancer you might have, take the vaccine. You will not get sick from it, and you will only improve your chances in battle with the COVID virus, should God forbid that happen.
So does that also apply to like anybody that has allergies to antibiotics or anything like that?
Right, so that's a different question. And so the question, as it relates to allergy risk or having an allergic tendency and the potential risk of the vaccine is a different question. And in general, I would say that unless, and they say if you have an allergy history to the component of the vaccine, it appears that this allergic reaction appears to be to what's called polyethylene glycol. So if you potentially know that you have a reaction to that substance, that would certainly be a reason for you to defer the vaccine. Outside of that, there's virtually no reason or no allergy risk that I would identify as being a reason to not take the vaccine.
So our next question is kind of along those lines, but are there any medical conditions, type 2 diabetes, tachycardia, lupus, anything like that, that would prevent somebody from, or considering getting the vaccine or considering that they should not get it done?
Yeah, I think, again, the underlying disease states are the reasons you want to get it. So let's say you had lupus, or let's say you had diabetes, or let's say you had heart disease or lung disease. You would want to take the vaccine. And the reason is because protecting yourself, even if it's partial protection, is better than taking the risk of getting the COVID virus. Because someone who's compromised, say from lupus, who then is exposed to COVID, has a greater risk from COVID. And so you do not want to assume the risk of COVID exposure. And the downside risk of the vaccine is really small. And so I would strongly encourage vaccination as opposed to the risk of, doing battle, if you will, with COVID. That's not a battle anybody wants to think about doing.
Okay. So next question, what makes the vaccine different from those with antibodies after they have already conquered the virus?
I'm sorry, Serena, I missed the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. So what makes the vaccine different from those with the antibodies after they have already conquered the virus?
Yeah, that's a great question. In other words, if you've had the virus, why wouldn't you be immune forever? Kind of like measles. I had measles when I was a child. I'm still immune to measles. I've never gotten the vaccine. I don't need the vaccine. So why wouldn't the same thing hold for COVID? And we don't yet know the answer. This is one of those unknowns yet. What we know is that with coronaviruses, it's not uncommon that immunity wanes, goes away, and you could get coronavirus again, or in this case, SARS-CoV-2. And so because we don't understand that fully yet, we're advising from a public health and a community protection point of view that everybody's got to get the vaccine because we just don't know how long that's going to last. But it may be that a year or two from now or 6 months from now, we will have either a better way to measure that or a better understanding for that. And we will say, yeah, if you've had the disease, you don't need to get the vaccine for 10 years or 5 years or wherever. We just don't know the answer to that. So just from a public health community protection point of view, we're advising that people who've had the disease still get the vaccine.
Okay, so just a few clarifying questions coming up next. The one, I think at the beginning of our discussion, you had mentioned that the vaccine protects us from infection. I thought it and this viewer says, I thought it protects us from the COVID-19 disease. So can you just maybe clarify for our viewer?
Right, so the vaccine absolutely protects you from COVID. So there's not a question about that. And I may have used that term somewhat interchangeably. The vaccine protects you from getting sick from the virus, period. What we don't understand is whether or not the vaccine prevents you from transmitting the virus to somebody else. So if you take the vaccine, you will not get sick with COVID. You will not get sick from SARS-CoV-2. But whether or not you could then potentially harbor the virus in your nose or mouth and transmit it to somebody, even though you're not sick, we still don't know the answer to that question fully. I'm suspicious you probably don't, but we don't know that. And until we know that, we're advising the use of the mask.
Okay, so the next question, again, just a clarifying question here. This is about, like, do you have to get the vaccine every year, like the flu shot?
Don't know the answer to that. At this particular point, we just don't know the answer. So I suspect over the next 6 months to 8 months, we're going to come up with some guidance or guidelines or understanding that will help inform us in regard to what our approach is going to be next year, if you will, for all of us who are getting the vaccine now? We just don't know. The answer's not there. Don't know.
Okay. So this is a very interesting question. During the clinical trials, how many people vaccinated actually died? How many got who got the placebo died? And what do you
None.
say? Zero?
Nobody who got the vaccine died. That's actually that was a great question and a really important point. Once you got your first dose of vaccine, there were no severe cases of COVID. None.
Wow.
If you didn't get the vaccine, I don't remember the number, Serena. There were a lot, not a lot. I mean, you know, there were about 169 cases of COVID in the Mrna study. And out of those, a substantial number were severe. But I don't know the number, so I don't want to quote it. But enough were severe to say, wow, like you just said. So yep, no severe cases after the first dose.
Good to hear. So along the lines, one of our viewers is asking, are there other alternative vaccines coming?
There are a lot of vaccines being studied. It's pretty cool, actually. And so I alluded to one of them. You all have heard about the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine that was approved in the United Kingdom. That's what's called a viral vector vaccine. Some of you may have participated in a study locally with Janssen. Janssen, which is an arm of J&J, is also studying a viral vector vaccine. That vaccine's interesting because it's one shot. Again, data not available yet, don't know the results. That study hasn't fully enrolled yet. Novavax, which is a US company, has produced a what's called a subunit vaccine. That's a very interesting vaccine product. That one is just entering phase 3 studies, which will allow us to understand the value of that vaccine. And then lastly, there are some DNA vaccines that are being investigated. So a lot of vaccines in the pipeline. I'm a big fan of the mRNA vaccines. There are some challenges with it. The cold chain is the one that you've all heard about. That is a challenge with it. The other vaccines I just mentioned tend to be lower cost and don't have the cold chain issue. So there may be some advantages to them, but we don't know their efficacy yet or how well they work. So more to come.
Sounds good. So we got a lot of great questions from our audience. So when in this evaluation process of a vaccination efficacy, are the placebo participants informed that they didn't get it? And what hopefully has occurred, the tested drug?
Yeah, I don't know the answer for that. That's a great question. There's certainly an ethical obligation at some point. There's been a lot of discussion about that because if you think about it, some of the questions about toxicities can only be fully answered by continuing to compare the placebo recipients to the vaccine recipients. And there's been a lot of discussion and debate within the scientific and medical community about how long can you ethically continue the placebo arm. They haven't answered the question yet. But it is being discussed. I don't know the answer to that question at this point, when they expect to offer the vaccine to placebo recipients. The flip side to the question, and part of the debate on this, it's really an important question, is that you know, a number of the folks in the study at some point are likely to just go on and get the vaccine regardless, and it will disrupt the data collection. So I suspect that over the next several months, they're going to, at least to me, the tone that I've heard, I think they'll be offering the vaccine to the placebo recipients, but to my understanding, that hasn't been done yet.
Okay. And again, I think the next couple questions are just some clarifying questions. In regards to how long do you have immunity after you get the vaccine, and how, if there are any negative side effects years after in their life, I think that was something you said, correct, that you were not sure of at this point.
Right, yeah, long-term side effects are long-term side effects. We just really are not going to know. One of the things that I make a point of, though, which is a really important point, and you can't lose sight of this, is that we may not know the long-term side effects of the vaccine from a 5-year, 10-year perspective. We also don't know the long-term side effects of the disease. What we do know is that this virus affects many organs in the body. And the one that I use most often in trying to help people gain perspective on this is the impact on the heart. And some of you may have heard or read about in the NFL, they have plenty of money, so they're running around doing lots of tests on these football players who've had COVID. And what they've identified is impacts of the virus on some of the players' hearts when they've done MRIs on them. That has me concerned. Some of these young men didn't have symptoms, but they had impacts of the virus on the heart. And so the question I would pose in thinking about long-term risk is, if I'm going to weigh it as an individual and I'm going to weigh long-term risk of the virus, long-term risk of the vaccine, I'm going to weigh what I know about the virus and what it does to me. So I'll talk about it personally, versus the vaccine and what I know about how this vaccine works and the mechanism by which it was developed. And in my mind, I'm taking the long-term risk, if you will, from the vaccine, because I don't understand biologically how it could cause a long-term risk, because it's not there. After a week, it's gone. But what I do know is that that virus is lingering. It's around in our bodies for, about 10 days in general. If you're real sick with it, 3 weeks. And it's affected many organs. And we don't know the long-term risk of those impacts of the virus on, let's say, our heart. So I'm not willing to take the long-term risk of that virus on my body, and I don't advise anyone to take that risk. I'll take what I really don't believe to be a long-term risk from a vaccine that's not around for more than a day or two, doing what it's supposed to do. So I think it's an easy calculation, but I really do understand the concern. But you got to weigh both. And so that's how you have to look at it.
Let's talk about the vaccination. So why 2 shots? And from the second injection, when should an individual expect to have antibodies or test positive for them?
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion about that. Maybe we only need 1 vaccine or 1 shot. Maybe we can reduce the dose by half. Maybe we can extend the interval between the 2 vaccines so we can get more people vaccinated. The problems with all that is, in the absence of study, we don't know that. So the first shot is what's called the sensitizing shot. It's the one that induces your immune response and gets your immune system revved up. The second shot is what I like to call a memory shot, or the long-term immunity shot. It's the one that induces a booster phenomenon and allows your body to remember better. And in remembering better, hopefully provide a longer term protection than a single shot. And so that's the reason we do both shots. Might we end up changing the recommendation in the future? Maybe. But at this particular point, I don't think we want to be modifying it till we understand it better.
So can you explain what the difference is between the Pfizer and Mrna vaccine, and why are they stored differently?
Essentially, there's no difference. They're both mRNA vaccines. They both code or give the recipe for the spike protein of the virus. They both limit the sequence or the recipe to only what's called a few base pairs. They both are packaged in this fat globule. The fat globule in both cases is almost identical. Both have this polyethylene glycol that I mentioned earlier. They both have some salts and buffers in it. The buffers are a little bit different. The reason for the difference in the cold storage, I don't know all the details, but what I can tell you is that Pfizer is studying their vaccine's stability at a less cold temperature. So Pfizer, when they started it, stored it at that. They didn't study it at a less cold temperature. So they need to do that to decide whether they can hold it at -20 as opposed to -70. So it remains to be seen. But both need to be at a cold chain, at a very cold temperature. -20 is still pretty cold. And the reason for that has to do with the stability. We call it the stability of mRNA. That's one of the reasons why I see these vaccines as so safe. mRNA is unstable. And so it has to be kept cold to maintain its effectiveness, because once it warms up, it just goes away. And our body temperature is 98.6. It's not going to last all that long inside our arms because it's not stable. That's sort of the point of the safety of it in my mind, is that the instability of it at warm temperatures. So don't know. I'm suspicious the Pfizer might be stable at -20, but they need to do the study to prove it.
And there's neither one has less side effects, correct?
The side effect profile is virtually identical.
Okay. These are really great questions, and I know we're at our 1:15 hour. If you're okay to stay on, I'll continue asking you a few more questions.
A few more minutes. Fine.
Okay. So the next one I think is a very good question. So we've heard about some mutations of the COVID virus, throughout our world. So can you explain the mutation, and also maybe go into maybe how that impacts or affects the vaccine, if at all?
So all germs, and let's specifically say all viruses in this case, mutate. That is just a feature of life. And the fact that there are mutations, and in the virology world, we call those mutations variants of the virus, is not surprising. It really doesn't matter whether it's, and we are actually all familiar with this as it relates to flu. You get a different flu, that's why you have to get a flu vaccine every year, because there are small changes or mutations that change the virus a little bit, that make the prior year's vaccines potentially not useful. So we're familiar with mutations because of that. It occurs in all viruses. This is not a new phenomenon. The real question is whether or not these mutations that occur change the virus enough that the vaccine that we are currently deploying will still be effective. For flu, we know that's one of the reasons we got to get a flu shot every year. For COVID, or for SARS-CoV-2, so far, it doesn't look that way. It doesn't mean that the next variant or the next mutation will not be resistant. It may be to the vaccine, but the current mutations that have been seen, the one in the UK and the one in South Africa, so far appear to be covered or protected against by the current vaccine. The other question that comes up with these variants or these mutations is, will the virus act differently? There are two or three questions about that. One is, will it be more contagious? The answer to that question appears to be yes, both with the UK variant or mutation and the South African mutation. The second important question is, will the disease be different? Will it be more aggressive? Will it make me sicker, or will it make someone sicker? So far, that question appears no. But if you got a disease that's more transmissible and more people get it, there will be more people very sick, simply because more people are getting the disease. The third one is the one we just talked about, is will it be protected by the vaccine? So far, it appears yes.
Okay, so we're getting in a lot of questions about pregnant women and fertility. And so, is it recommended that women that are pregnant get the vaccination, and does that impact fertility, either pre-conception or post?
So let me take the three questions around pregnancy and childbirth, in sequence. So I'm going to take the breastfeeding question first, even though you didn't ask me that.
Okay, that was my next question.
so that one may be the easier one for me to answer. So the breastfeeding question, I think, is pretty easy. Get the vaccine. Here's my reason for it, and I think the support from the Pediatric Society and the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. The vaccine's not, it's in and of itself is not a risk to your baby. And when mom takes the vaccine, the breast milk then has the antibodies, and you can pass those antibodies to your baby, and your baby indirectly gets protected. I think, to me, that seems like a no-brainer. I understand the hesitancy, but I think that makes a lot of sense to me. If you are pregnant and you're considering the vaccine, how do you weigh this decision? I think you weigh this decision by weighing your potential risk of getting sick with COVID. For me, the risk of COVID, if you're pregnant, is greater than the risk of the vaccine. So, say for example you're in healthcare, or say for example you work in long-term care, or say for example your family members do, or say you have whatever exposure that puts you at risk, and you have a risk of getting COVID. I'd rather see you take the risk of the vaccine, because I don't see a lot of downside risk of the vaccine. Now, it wasn't studied in pregnant women. It just wasn't. I will tell you that of the first million doses, I think it is, this is the latest I've seen. So first million doses of the vaccine, about 580 pregnant women got it. So we will get information on the vaccine in pregnancy, because, you know, if you give the vaccine to lots of millions of people, some of them will end up being pregnant, and we will get information. We don't have any summary information about it yet. The third one is, you're considering pregnancy, men or women, and you're worried about its impact on fertility. How might it affect the sperm or the ovum, the egg? And the reason I think part of this question comes up, again, gets back to this issue of the nomenclature. It's an mRNA vaccine. Is it somehow going to affect the sperm or the ova? And the answer is no. It's not a DNA vaccine. It's an RNA vaccine. And there's no wherewithal for the RNA to somehow interfere with spermatogenesis or oocyte formation and cause a concern for some type of trouble with fertility or conception. So I would have no real issue or concern around an RNA vaccine having some impact on fertility. So hopefully that addresses those three areas.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So let's say somebody has their first shot of the vaccine, it's given, and then that person gets COVID in between the first and the second dose. Can they receive the second dose on time? How would that work?
They have to delay that dose because they now have COVID. And remember, in the earlier part of the discussion, I said anybody with active COVID, you're going to delay the vaccine for 90 days after your infection. So there would be no role for, and you should not take that vaccine within the 90 days after having it, even though, unfortunately, from a timing point of view, your episode occurred within that time window between the first and second dose.
Okay, sounds good. Now, a lot of people are curious, like, can you explain how this vaccine is being rolled out into the community in terms of who's getting vaccinated first, second, third, et cetera, and then, you know, share how the community will be able to get the vaccine?
Yeah, it's being staged. The vaccine distribution is being staged. The guidance for the distribution was developed by both the Institute of Medicine and the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, which is an arm of the Centers for Disease Control. And they took into account all sorts of things around equity and urgency and risk. And they came up with a staging program, and many of you have heard this, the so-called phases, and they've divided it into phase 1A, 1B, 1C, and then phase 2. Phase 1A was healthcare workers and long-term care residents. Phase 1B was anybody over 75 and essential workers. And phase 1C is people with comorbid conditions. And then phase 2 is like everybody else. So that's the way that system was developed. We are shortly going to be entering into phase 1B. Right now we're in phase 1A, which is healthcare workers, long-term care. I don't make the decision. I don't really know exactly when we go to phase 1B, but my understanding is probably in the next week or so. There are a lot of people, me included, who think we are not distributing this vaccine fast enough. I'd like to see us actually enter phase 1B and C sooner. I think we need to just get it out to more people faster, because we've got to get enough people vaccinated to get close to herd immunity to get us back to normal. Remember, my wish for all of you a socially close New Year. We're not going to get there if you don't get your vaccines. Get your vaccines.
So thank you. So if somebody is in, let's say, category 1A, and obviously at our hospital here, we are presently vaccinating our healthcare providers and our medical staff. But for those who are not within our what we call pod or our organization, and if they're in category 1A, how do they get it? Is the best place for them to or individuals to speak to is the Department of Health?
Yeah, I think that there's two things that you want to do. There's a website that you can go to register. And again, if you go to the New Jersey Department of Health, you can register on that site. But more importantly, if you're a healthcare worker, there's a list on that website of sites that are vaccinating healthcare workers. The definition is pretty broad. And so, for example, if you're a dietary consultant in the community with an independent practice, you're patient facing. You should go to one of those facilities. Actually, ShopRite, give them a plug. They're doing a pretty good job, I got to tell you. So a number of the folks in my organization, ID Care, actually have gone out and gotten vaccinated at ShopRite. But there are many other locations. So some of the counties have actually started vaccinating. Middlesex County, for those of you that live in Middlesex County, is doing a great job from a county perspective. Essex County is vaccinating. So each of these locations, though, are identified on the New Jersey website. When you Google New Jersey Department of Health COVID vaccine, you'll find the listing. It's pretty long. And so I would encourage you to go there and sign up.
Sounds good. So again, and yes, please follow up with those organizations, as there are sites that are giving the shots. This next set of questions is, again, revolving around the COVID vaccine and the flu shot. So could you explain what kind of vaccine the flu shot is and how is it different from the mRNA COVID vaccine? And then in addition, should somebody, I mean, it's a little late in flu season, but should they still get the flu shot? And does that affect the administration of the COVID-19 vaccine?
Right, so we're advising anybody that's had another vaccine, wait 14 days before they get their COVID vaccine. Not because we know that there's a problem, but it's an unknown. And so we think it's prudent to give you that 2-week window. The flu vaccine, there's many different types. There is no current approved mRNA influenza vaccine. There are some that are being looked at. Mrna is actually developing an mRNA influenza vaccine. But there are some subunit recombinant vaccines, kind of like what's called the Novavax. Novavax is one of the companies. And so there are different variants of the flu vaccine that are available, some of which are the older technology, some of which are newer technologies. The mRNA variants of that are not yet commercially available. My suspicion is the mRNA vaccines are going to supplant most of the vaccines that we currently are using. We're going to see more and more of these.
Great. Okay, thank you. So I'm just going through some of these. A lot of these questions we have answered regarding allergic reactions.
Yeah, I've got about 2 more minutes, Serena.
Okay. All right. So let me just see if I can. Okay. So again, with COVID-19, we have seen that it has disproportionately affected some sectors of our community. And this next question is regarding or around that. So we know the virus has disproportionately affected people of color, particularly African Americans and Latinos. Did the vaccination studies results have any difference in the effectiveness among these populations?
No, and as we meant, it did not. And that's a great question. It's really important from the perspective of reassurance that regardless of race or ethnicity, the vaccine demonstrated equal efficacy. And the follow-up to that could be, were there enough of the minority populations enrolled to be able to make those claims? And the answer is yes. They did a great job at doing that. So we need to reassure these communities that, in fact, it worked great. Take the vaccine. It's safe and it's effective.
Okay. So, and again, you do have a lot of people who are a little apprehensive. So it's extremely difficult to advocate for the vaccine when you hear some of our employees or coworkers may not want to receive the vaccine. Again, what is your message to them?
Yeah, it is difficult. There's always a lot of vaccine hesitancy. It's something that's new. It's something that's uncertain. And so my message is what I like to think has been my theme throughout. One, you're weighing the disease of COVID and the chance of getting that or the possibility of getting that and its consequences versus the risk of the vaccine. And when we think about the disease of COVID, you have to not only think personally for yourself, you've got to think about others around you, those you love, those you call friends. Because even if it doesn't affect you in a negative way, remember, you can be asymptomatic, particularly in the first 2 days, and still transmit the disease. And if you do that, and that person who may be more compromised than you gets sick and dies, you've contributed. The vaccine does not, to the best that we can do, does not appear to have a lot of risk. The disease has a lot of risk. And so I try to emphasize the perception as it relates to risk of disease versus the vaccine. The risk perception is personal for you as well as those you love, versus the safety of what we know about this vaccine and its technology. And so, that's the best that we can do and lead by example. And so when we're talking with others and we're speaking with others, step up, put your arm out, demonstrate your strength and your belief, and, use the example that I said about those volunteers. God bless them, right? Can you imagine 80,000 people? And they got the placebo. I don't know, they didn't know they were going to get the vaccine. God bless them for doing that.
So, Dr. Nahass, as we conclude today's webinar, what are some key points about the COVID-19 vaccine that you would like to leave our audience with today?
Mine is, I don't know where I lost my thing. I had a sticker. Oh, here it is. So I think that there are a couple of things. One is I hope that the webinar today emphasized how good this vaccine is. It really is amazing. The vaccine is an amazing accomplishment for technology, for medicine. It's highly effective. We couldn't have asked for a more positive result. It is extraordinarily safe. I don't think there's a question about that. And it's the only way we are going to enjoy a socially close New Year. So my message is, I don't know if you can read that. Can you read that?
Very difficult. What is it? Oh, not throwing away my shot.
Not throwing away my shot. So anybody that's a Hamilton fan, Lin-Manuel Miranda sings that song. You should Google it and listen to it. Even the words in the song are motivating to thinking about not throwing away your shot. One of my Twitter posts, I guess, was about not throwing away my shot because I'm young and rambunctious. You want to be young and rambunctious. He was talking about the country. Get your shot. We can be socially close. We all have a role to play. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And two important information before we depart. Tonight, Robert Wood Johnson University Hospital Somerset is offering a webinar, similar webinar to our Latino community in Spanish from 6:30 to 7:30. It is on our website. One of our viewers was kind enough to post the website for COVID. It's https://covid19.nj.gov/pages/vaccines. So this will conclude today's webinar. Please remember that the opinions expressed here by our medical expert are not a substitute for medical advice from your own physician. If you need a physician, please call our physician referral service number at 1-888-724-7123. And for more information about COVID-19, please visit our website at www.rwjbh.org /Somerset. Thank you, Dr. Nahass, and thank you to all of our audience for joining our webinar this afternoon. We hope you will take your shot and be well. Have a great afternoon. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye all.